This is Frontline.
Arms transfers, allegedly a payoff, began just after Ronald Reagan's inauguration. But those sales were only the first of many secret arms sales to come. Tonight, Bill Moyers examines the Iran-Contra affair.
North Notebooks. Joshua has approved proceeding. If these conditions are acceptable to the banana, then oranges are ready to proceed.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons for hostages, nor will we.
North Notebooks. Center the activity in the White House.
I'm not going to tell falsehoods to the American people, and I'll leave that to others.
It was inconceivable to me at the time that they weren't aware of the large outlines of what we were doing, including how we were handling our money.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
For the moment, at least, the principal focus of the committee's attention is a story that's been out of the headlines for years, that was thought to be all but dead and buried, the Iran-Contra scandal. To President Bush, allegations that Robert Gates knew more about Iran-Contra than he ever admitted to Congress are no more than a patchwork of slurs and innuendo.
I really feel strongly about this. I just don't think it's the American way to bring a good man down by rumor and insinuation.
There is evidence, but it is largely circumstantial. Richard Secord, a retired Air Force general with long-standing ties to the CIA, was at the center of both the Iran arms operation and the Contra resupply network.
Everybody of importance, from the president on down, was well aware of the important aspects of both of these operations, the Contra and the Iranian operations. It was inconceivable to me at the time that they weren't aware of the large outlines of what we were doing, including how we were handling our money.
And when you say everyone, you include Robert Gates?
I would include every senior guy in the Central Intelligence Agency at the time that had a need to know.
And he had a need to know?
I would say the deputy had a need to know. They built a stone wall around the president starting in late 1986. And I don't say they covered it up so much as they stonewalled. And then they left 6 or 7 of us out on the outside of the wall to essentially be scapegoated.
Secord, his associate Albert Hakim, former National Security Advisor John Poindexter, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Those were the more prominent people left outside the wall, to use General Secord's phrase.
Now, with the recent revelations about CIA knowledge, I believe that what I have said and what others have said is being vindicated. That is to say that we weren't alone. We weren't just a small band of rogues operating within the administration, in support of the administration. We were really a part of a much larger operation. It remains to be seen how much of this will unravel in the weeks to come.
So why go through years of this agony of trying to cover it up?
I think it was politically stupid. I've said this before. It's a tragedy. It's ruined the lives of a lot of men, myself included. It is a needless bleeding and hemorrhaging that took place. The president should have gotten up on his soapbox in 1986 and come clean, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking today.
Now, what about the specifics of what you were doing? It is entirely possible that the administration authorized, sort of in general terms, this operation, but that the executive branch would not have known specifically what you were doing.
Well, I suppose theoretically that's possible, but in fact, so many people from different agencies knew what we were doing, including Central Intelligence Agency, that the fact is it was well known what we were doing in a fairly wide circle of people, and I believe now you're seeing this starting to come to light.
General Secord, you don't like what happened today. At least on one level, you don't like it. You want to explain that?
Well, I just think that it's a gross abuse of prosecutorial discretion. This is 5.5 years after the fact, to go after Caspar Weinberger, a distinguished American public servant for decades, to bring this kind of humiliation on him for no reason at all. is just absolutely gross, and I think it's an outrage, and I think every American ought to call the White House and insist the president fire this guy.
Now, you talk about the distinguished career of Secretary Weinberger, but there's an Air Force general who's on this program with me tonight whose career was also hurt, and who was left, I was going to say left, you were hung out to dry by some of the very people who have also been, let me put it this way, Lawrence Walsh has been trying to get to some of the folks who gave you directions. And I know that has troubled you in the past because you've told me so on this broadcast.
Well, that's true, but my criticism has been of former President Reagan for failure to step up to the plate and take the credit and take the heat when this thing blew up in 1986. Certainly not been directed at Cap Weinberger. I think that I've read this 30-page indictment. I've never seen such a conglomeration of mishmash and trivia.
Well, why do you consider it mishmash and trivia? I mean, essentially, there has been, it seems to me, a cover-up, at least of those who gave orders to people like you and Albert Hakim and Oliver North and others. And if, in fact, it wasn't Caspar Weinberger, it may indeed have gone higher than Caspar Weinberger. I have a feeling that what Mr. Walsh has been trying to do is climb that ladder, and he hasn't gotten a whole lot of help.
Well, I disagree, Ted. I don't think Mr. Walsh has tried to climb any ladder at all until recent months. For the first 3 or so years of this thing, he spent all of his time trying to color about 4 of us as the bad guys, the rogues, the rogue elephants. And only recently has he been converted to the view that there was wider knowledge within the government and has continued this witch hunt, $100 million taxpayer expense. And, you know, I can only say that I believe it's just a total outrage.
Iran-Contra is hardly one of the issues George Bush would have chosen as being central to this presidential campaign of 1992, any more than Bill Clinton would have chosen the issue of his own Vietnam-era draft record. But each issue is being used by the other campaign as evidence that Bush and Clinton, respectively, are not to be trusted. What Clinton did as a young college student, the argument goes, may have no direct relevance to whether he should be president today. But if he has continually lied about what he did then, up to and including the present, that does matter. In that context, we examined the issue of Clinton's draft record more than a week ago. And so, tonight, we look at George Bush and the Iran-Contra scandal. What he did in 1986 is relevant to this campaign only to the extent that he is accused of repeatedly lying about his actions since then. That is the charge against George Bush. And insofar as honesty, integrity, and facing up to past mistakes have been raised as key questions about Bill Clinton's character, so too, this evening, we present the case against George Bush. Here's correspondent John Martin.
Do you solemnly swear?
It is the most enduring scandal of the 80s, the sale of missiles to Iran for the release of Americans in Lebanon, the diversion of proceeds to the rebels in Nicaragua against the wishes of Congress.
This morning, the president directed that
when this became public in 1986, no one accepted responsibility.
The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon. Those charges are utterly false.
At first, the Vice President, George Bush, said he had no role in it. A few days later, he spoke in Washington.
I'd like to say something about my own role in all of this. I was aware of our Iran initiative, and I support the president's decision.
At the time, President Reagan said he made no deal for the hostages. The White House said it had been talking to Iranian moderates. Yet documents show George Bush was told 4 months earlier the U.S. was dealing with radicals.
And I oppose any diversion of funds, any ransom payments, or any circumvention of the will of the Congress, the law of the United States of America.
Over time, Mr. Bush has altered his story. He said he was kept from knowing what was going on. He said he opposed what was going on.
I think the key players around there know that I expressed certain reservations on certain aspects.
He told Washington Post columnist David Broder he didn't express reservations because he didn't know how much Secretary of State George Shultz and Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger opposed the policy of selling missiles to Iran. If I'd have sat there and heard George Shultz and Cap express it strongly, Mr. Bush said, maybe I would have had a stronger view. But when you don't know something, it's hard to react. We were not in the loop. But in recent weeks, the Bush explanations have been open to challenge. A newly released memo shows that when the Broder column appeared, Weinberger called Shultz to complain. The memo, written for Shultz, says, Vice President, in papers yesterday, said he was not exposed to Cap or my arguments on Iran arms. Cap called me and said, that's terrible. He was on the other side. It's on the record. Why did he say that? In a new book, Richard Secord, a central figure, says that the Vice President, in effect, lied.
George Bush and his supporters have said repeatedly, as I recall, that he was not in the loop, meaning on the Iran affair or on the Contra operation. That's simply not the case with respect to Iran.
Now, the allegation that Mr. Bush was well inside the loop comes from retired Air Force Major General Richard Secord, who, along with Oliver North, was a key figure in the scandal and later pleaded guilty to a charge of lying to Congress. General Secord details his allegations in a new book that is called Honored and Betrayed, and Richard Secord is joining us this morning from Washington. General, good to have you with us.
Good morning, Charlie.
Let me find out exactly what it is that you're alleging. And we often use the term Iran-Contra, which encompasses so much. Any knowledge on your part that Mr. Bush knew of or was involved in the use of arms sales profits from Iran for Contra aid in Nicaragua?
No, I certainly knew nothing of any of that.
Okay. Are you alleging any involvement by the now president, then vice president, in any illegalities?
No, I make that very clear that I don't think that he did anything wrong at all.
All right, so what you're writing about refers strictly to the Iran part of the operation and the sale of arms to Iran, presumably in exchange for hostage release.
Sure, I think the record ought to be straightened out on this issue, and I want to make it clear up front that I support President Bush for re-election, so I'm not trying to bash him at all. In fact, I think his qualifications place him head and shoulders above his opponent. But the notion that he didn't know anything or know much about the so-called Iran initiative is not correct. And I detail in my writing one particularly important incident wherein he was briefed by the Israeli agent Amram Nir in July of 1986 about all of the tactical details of this operation. And a major policy change ensued immediately thereafter. Last night on this network, Howard Teicher, a former National Security Council staffer, also said that he had briefed the vice president on several occasions about the details of the Iran-Contra affair. So what I write is not at all about, it's not writing a book about President Bush. He's a very minor character in this 30 years account.
No, but you realize, obviously, especially in light of the election and in light of all of the controversy that's going on over Iran-Contra, that those details in the book become very critical. And essentially what you're saying, in saying what you just said, is that he was not out of the loop, but that he was in the loop in the decisions that were made.
Well, that's my understanding of the loop. I suppose in the coming days there'll be a lot of semantical debate about what a loop is, but that's certainly my understanding of the loop. I believe that there are many witnesses now who can corroborate that he was certainly well briefed on the Iran initiative.
All right, but well briefed is one thing. You made a mention a moment ago about this meeting in 1986 where he met with the head of Israeli intelligence, Mr. Nir, who is now dead. And in that meeting, you point out that there was a change in U.S. policy immediately following the meeting. Now, there's been no denial that Mr. Bush was in that meeting. It's just a question of whether he was responsible for that change of policy after it occurred. Is that not the question?
That's correct. I thought it was kind of interesting. Last night on Nightline, Craig Fuller, the former chief of staff to the Vice President Bush, let it slip that after that briefing, they reported back, which is exactly what I say in the book. When you're reporting back, you're in the loop in my book.
Well, but there's really some dispute as to whether the change of policy came as a result of Mr. Bush's meeting with Mr. Nir or whether it was already decided upon.
No, I think that the record, which has been reported extensively in the past few days in the major newspapers, is clear. This change of policy came about after the briefing and immediately after, and I'm not saying that Vice President Bush was entirely responsible for that, not at all. I don't make that allegation at all. What I say is that he was in the loop, and he did report this back.
Do you think, looking at your view of all of this and also what you've written about here, that Mr. Bush has a credibility problem on this issue?
Well, I think it could become a big credibility problem, and I'm glad it's coming out now with 6 weeks to go to the election, because I think it's easy to fix.
How? Why?
By simply admitting that, yes, I was in the loop in a common sense sort of way. I didn't know anything about the Contra operations, which I happen to believe is true. But certainly I was very well advised on all aspects of the Iran initiative. That's what I would say.
How much, obviously there are other questions that have revolved around how much then President Reagan knew about all parts of the operation, both the Iran-Contra, the Iran arms sale part, and the use of some of the profits for aiding the Contras. How much do you feel President Reagan knew?
Well, like Ollie North, I believe he knew virtually everything about the Iran initiative and a tremendous amount about the Contra operation as well.
He was also part of one of the biggest political scandals of the last 10 years. It all began when he offered to help Oliver North and the late CIA director William Casey with what we now know as Iran-gate. He eventually found out that by offering his help, life would never be the same. Secord tells his story in this book, Honored and Betrayed, and he joins me this afternoon. Welcome.
Good to be here.
Are you a little surprised, General, that the Iran situation hasn't come up in either one of the debates?
No, I think probably Clinton is saving that for a little counterpunching tonight. The Democrats and the liberal press, which includes all the Washington National Press Corps, as far as I'm concerned, have been in a frenzy trying to defeat Bush here lately, and I think they're saving this up as some of their ammunition.
Well, Bush has continuously said through the years that he knew nothing. He was out of the loop, so to speak, when it came to being aware that hostages were being traded for arms. Was he out of the loop?
Well, he was not out of the loop on the Iran initiative, and I write about that.
Now, how does that differ from...
But see, there's a lot of... This is a very complex story.
Yes.
And what I think Bush has been saying all along, what I've been reading him to say, is that he was out of the loop on Iran-Contra, hyphen being the so-called diversion of funds
to the
Contra support effort, which was a private effort, in which I don't think he had any role to play at all. I should know. I was in the middle of it. And I know he didn't know anything about the so-called diversion. But I think that his spin doctors have, and he himself have kind of muddled the story by saying he was out of the loop on Iran-Contra, you see. Although on other occasions, George Bush has said that he briefed the president, he had been briefed himself, he was briefed by the Israelis, he knew all the tactical details.
All right, it's complex, as you say, It's somewhat confusing. Let's clear this up. We have Iran-Contra.
Right.
Arms are being sold. The money that is made from those arms are diverted to the Contras in Nicaragua because supposedly it's against the law in this country to take taxpayers' dollars and help the Contras at that time. The other issue is the arms being sold to Iran in exchange for hostages. The president supposedly also says he was, up until recently, he was unaware that hostages were being exchanged for arms. Is that correct?
Yeah, because what the president is saying, and I don't want to be presumptuous and say what the president is saying, but what I think he is saying is that the finding that then President Reagan signed in 1986 in January said that the primary objective of this Iran initiative was to gain and maintain a contact and rapport with more moderate or pragmatic elements of the then Iranian government. And then to move on and use that influence to free up the hostages in Lebanon. By the end of that year, though, it got stood on its head, and it really did become an arms for hostage transfer.
In a surprise visit to the Today Show, you probably are aware of this.
Yeah, I read that.
He walked in, Barbara Bush had been interviewed by Katie Couric, and Katie Couric said to him, do you have any knowledge of the Iran-Contra arms for hostages deal while you were in office as vice president? And then went on to say, after that, you knew about the arms for hostages. We want to play the little clip of this and just get your reaction.
Sure.
This is from the Today Show 2 mornings ago.
I want you to go ahead. Clarify what you think was
what was asked was whether I knew that Caspar Weinberger and Schultz, how strongly they opposed it. And I said to that, there were 2 key meetings where they almost got into a shouting match, I'm told, that I did not attend. But I said all along that I knew about the arms going, and I supported the president. I gave speeches about it.
We've only got about 30 seconds left. Your reaction to his comment there, is he saying anything different?
No, I think
You don't.
I don't think so.
The title of your book, Honored and Betrayed. You've been honored many times. As I said, distinguished service. Were you betrayed by your country?
I was betrayed by then President Ronald Reagan, along with all the people who worked for me and with me.